Hello, everybody. Very few rules. If you've participated before, you know that we just ask that you mute yourself, but always feel like you can stop us at any time in the discussion and ask questions. What we're going to talk about today is going to push the boundary outside of the compliance comfort space for most people. So if you're a compliance person and your history and familiarity is in regulatory structures, California, Washington, the federal government, even the EU. Today, we're going to talk about something a bit broader and a little bit more. It's a lot newer, but a little bit more involved with other people on larger teams. And so it's really going to spread our wings. And let me hit share, get this going. All right, Gavin, can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. Let's get going, hit slideshow, start. All right, so I'm going to be doing two things while I talk to everybody. I'm going to be looking at this screen because I took some really good notes on this. We're going to be talking about technology. We don't often talk about Trakref, but we are going to talk a little bit about Trakref today. This is a bit of a passion project for us. Starting in the mid-90s, our advocacy on reducing leak rates is what drove us to this point where we're at with software. We found that software was a really simple, effective way. I learned, by the way, that simple is really in the relative term simple. It's not simple at all, but it is simple when you use it. And the reason that software was so valuable is it's going to help the industry as we make this shift away from thinking about sustainability reporting being voluntary to being required. And we're making this shift. Most of the data that we've all participated in helping develop or document has all been largely around the machine room and operations. And now that data is going to be visible in the boardroom. So there was a really fascinating, interesting Accenture study. They surveyed 640 CFOs, and the overwhelming majority of these CFOs felt like they were managing this part of Scope 1 emissions blind. They overall felt like Scope 1 emissions was a very blind management process for them. But particularly in fugitive emissions, they voiced some very deep concerns about their operational awareness. And there are several frameworks out there that exist today for reporting. The good news for everybody on this call is there really are only a few basic principles for reporting refrigerants. And they fall into two buckets. One is the bucket where you estimate your emissions, and the other bucket, and by the way, that bucket's going to be going away. And the other bucket is where you have to have an attestation or assurance of the results. And we really feel like technology is a terrific fit to help accomplish this. And that's what's been driving us for a long time. I'll skip that part. For those of you who are new to the topic, Scope 1 emissions are where refrigerants fall under fugitive emissions. Scope 2 is anybody who's purchasing electricity, heating, or cooling. So maybe you're part of a city water system or a city steam heat system, or you have somebody on premise or near premise who's providing you with those things. Or maybe you lease a property and you buy purchased heating or cooling. And then Scope 3 emissions. And towards the end, I'll get Chase to chime in because he was on a webinar recently, and it sounds like Scope 1 and 2 emissions, you can almost take this to the bank in the next 180 days. We're going to see these be required, but Scope 3 may be lurking a little bit further out. All right, why are we here? Well, refrigerant, I mean, I know it's always been the center of most of our lives on this call, but refrigerant, if you're unfamiliar with its impact, it will have a greater impact than all the electric vehicles placed on the road. So it's a fairly significant number. And I just was participating in a research study in the Middle East, and they're estimating their overall greenhouse gas emissions, including all hydrocarbons, are GHG emissions from fugitive emissions are about 25% of total emissions. So it's very big. And by the way, this statistic came from Project Drawdown for anybody who's looking for a reference. Now, if you're wondering what's the before and after about what we're talking about at the SEC, and I'll share a slide in a second about the SEC. The before is here in the left column where we've been with EPA 608. And there are really only about 180,000 properties, and we're doing some estimating here, but we feel comfortable with that number, that have had a level of responsibility for managing and reporting refrigerants. But that number is about to shift to 3.6 million, or roughly 80% of all commercial properties in the United States. You can see those numbers here on the left versus the right. And very rarely are we auditing, or are we seeing audits done of these numbers. Most commonly, they're internally audited, unless, of course, you've been part of some bigger action which involves the EPA or a government agency. It tends to be that the government agency is the auditor. But that's about to change. Annual audits and outside assurance or attestation firms will now be looking over the data that you're collecting. So if you're a service provider and you're wondering, why am I getting all these requests for more information? Well, it's probably because of the SEC. It's not because of changes in environmental regulations, because we've been doing a good job of staying up to date and on schedule with that as an industry. But the SEC, starting on March 21st, really threw a left curve into the industry with a very aggressive move towards capturing this information, if it's already part of your public disclosure. Now, in case you were wondering what's happening additionally, in the EU, we have our before and after as well. And there's a lot going on there. Before, we had about 11,000, 12,000 companies. That's the total scope of the action. And today we have about 49,000 that will come under this proposed CSRD update to the regulation. And the idea here is that these don't perfectly line up. And what I want to impress upon everybody is, if you feel like it's an overwhelming challenge to understand how all these pieces fit together like a Lego brick, or they don't. I mean, this is like having Lincoln Logs and Legos. They're completely different, although they're still trying to accomplish the same thing with this improved reporting and extra requirements for record keeping. All right, I want to go through some of these early slides, and I'm going to try to keep this to a half hour. So this is specifically what you're reporting when you're reporting Scope 1 emissions. This is directly from TCFD's, which is one of the frameworks, reporting disclosure responsibility checklist. And to enhance that, we have this very specific wording about fugitive emissions. I'm going to stop, let everybody read it. And Gavin, make sure that there's no hands up or questions to be answered.
Yeah, no questions right now.
All right, great. All right, well, good news. We're almost a third of the way through. Look, in all the discussions that we're having, I want to make a notable mention about fire suppression systems. Many of you may know, some of you may not. So an update. Many fire suppression systems, particularly the handheld devices like this or larger centralized systems, do contain some type of HFC refrigerant. And the expectation is that those will be reported. They tend to be reportable only during some type of catastrophe. So just keep note of that. The industry is also in transition away from these materials. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, refrigerants like R125 or 227 that are in these fire suppression systems be pulled back off your shelf and replaced with other materials. And it's a good idea for you to be aware of what's in your system. So important to ask your vendors. You may not know that. In a very quick survey this week of just phone calls to clients, most had no idea what was in the systems. They assumed it was CO2, but they didn't know, and they didn't have an inventory. But all said they would reach out to their vendors and check. So it's an interesting mention because in Europe, for instance, F gases, so fluorine gases, are not just isolated to HVAC and refrigeration systems. So their list includes things like circuit breakers, so GIS, and there's a lot broader awareness about what those F gases are. So the basket that they work from is less isolated to brand names and more about the material content. And so if anybody here works for a company that has an operation in Europe or is reporting their numbers to Europe or is responsible for record keeping in a European format, then you'll have different requirements than your peers. And you'll need some type of technology to keep track of that. And that's why I'm bringing it up. Now, very specifically, this is what the SEC posted on their website, and it speaks for itself. One of the caveats to this is the original comment period was to end on May 20th, and the SEC has extended this to June 9th. So if you have a comment or you find that this is an important topic to you and you want to read about the comments, send us or drop us a message. We'll connect you to the right link at the SEC so you can follow along. I know I didn't think this would be as robust a topic. When the SEC actually opened this discussion process on March 20th, 2021, so a whole year ago, I thought there'd be 100 to 300 submissions on the website, related to the SEC's inclusion of ESG disclosure responsibilities. I was wrong. There were 5,000. Okay, 5,000 comments submitted to the SEC. And these comments range from really large corporations to individuals like myself or you. So it is not too difficult to make a comment to the SEC. And you have time. All right. In case you're wondering how severe is this, somebody in your company, and you may be the person, if you are the person that signs the 10K, will be signing this document and agreeing that all of the facts that are presented in your ESG disclosures, your Scope 1 emissions reporting, are accurate. And if they're found to be inaccurate, or you were found to not have done your job for assurance or attestation of these facts, then you'll be liable if you're the person who made that signature. So we're seeing a lot more scrutiny over the way that we embrace the data that's coming from operations. And so it's very important to note that for the last 28 years, this data has stayed in a certain realm and very rarely earned its way up to the boardroom or anybody above the operational level. But that's not happening. And many of you may be experiencing this already. And so what you're finding is you have a higher frequency of providing reports to this team, a higher expectation about the details in those reports, and a more comprehensive expectation of your awareness or their awareness about what's actually happening in operations. Because for anybody to put their signature on a 10K means that they have sanitized this information from top to bottom and they feel very comfortable with it. Otherwise, they wouldn't sign. Any questions there so far, Gavin?
No, I think we're good.
All right, good. Because essentially what the SEC has done is they've taken these voluntary ESG reports, which were largely aspirational and marketing oriented, and they have made them, they have decided that because shareholders use these documents, they have now made sure that the documentation process will be accurate. No more estimating, no more greenwashing, whether it's intentional or unintentional, no more marketing about how great a company is doing. As a matter of fact, I was part of an early morning group where we were talking about how a marketing team had been using information from previous ESG disclosure documents as part of their marketing, and now how that information was no longer allowed to be used by the marketing team because it was not assured or attestable. The company could not attest to the facts related to it. I found that to be very interesting. But refrigerants are complex. These things are moving throughout everybody's system, small and large transactions. If you had historically believed that 50 pounds was your limit, maybe 25 pounds, maybe 20. Well, today, you might find that your ecosystem now requires that you document 6-ounce systems as accurately as you do 25-pound systems. Now, maybe you don't have to track the maintenance, like a leak inspection, but you do if you're in Europe. And there is a window of time, and that window is based on the GWP of the material. So this is getting much more complicated. And refrigerants, because they're moving everywhere, and if you're a multi-location company and you think, man, we've got our arms around this, we've got a compliance team and they're doing a great job. Well, now you have to ask yourself, at the ounce level or the 1 pound level, how will your management of that data and that process be? And if you're a comfort cooling company and you thought, well, I only need to document this because of the EPA's responsibilities, you may find that your clients, I guarantee it's going to happen everywhere, are requiring documentation on those refrigerant transactions at a far lower level than the 50-pound threshold that the industry has come to be familiar with. So we need to abandon that process. And we need to start thinking about the fact that the people that are engaging with this data, sometimes they're chief sustainability officers, but the chief sustainability officer is not the one signing the 10K. So the person signing the 10K tends to be either the CEO or the CFO, and most likely it's the CFO. So you heard me say it before, but we need to start making this move away from aspirations towards operations. Now, you'll see a term on the right side here called phantom emissions. And one of the things that we've noticed in all of our reviews of documentation from last year going into this year has been that there's a large gap in the integrity in the information. Now, if these are the 8 steps, and I believe there's 8 documented here, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If these are the 7 steps that a normal accounting process goes through, most likely, if you're doing this and you've been part of this compliance world, you are familiar with identifying the transaction. But you're probably not resolving anomalies, posting a ledger that gets periodically reviewed, calculating an adjusted balance. You're probably resolving miscalculations after the fact, but these are all things that technology should be able to do for you, including resolving any extenuating circumstances like retrofitted assets that provide a change to your carbon footprint, or being able to generate a carbon impact statement, much the same way that you might generate a balance sheet or a P&L at the end of a period of time, whether that be monthly or quarterly. And I can tell you, our engagement at this point is a lot more frequent than it used to be. Companies that we talk to annually, we now talk to quarterly. Companies that we talk to quarterly, we're now talking to weekly or monthly. So things are really starting to change around the awareness. And some of those discussions are about ramping up processes and reaching out to the vendors that service the smaller systems. And that's a big part of the discussion. All right, any questions so far on this? All right. This came directly from the Accenture study, and Accenture's direct quote was, many companies are still managing this blind. And after the survey, what they needed most was useful insights about how operations was already handling the data. And one of the biggest vulnerabilities that these companies felt they would experience the most from not being able to have access to good information was the ability to raise capital, because they felt like that was increasingly being tied to sustainability objectives. And deficiencies in the ability of these companies to target, manage, and measure sustainability goals or performance was hampering their ability to effectively set goals for their company that they could then manage. So this is as much about what's going to happen in the future as is what's happening today. One of the most common requests I get today, and we're doing a lot with reporting around this, is a request to forecast future emission rates based on present system inventory. So if we keep our 404, what do our emission rates look like? The state of California is doing some interesting stuff around setting site-wide GHG impact limits. So we'll have to drop from 2,500 down to 1,900. We've got a few years to do it, but not very many when you consider the amount of investment that's been made in these systems. And in many cases, there's a lot of depreciation left on the books. It's hard to write that off really quickly. So we've always felt, and I'm not shy to share with you here, that software really is the ideal way to modify behavior because you can keep the focus on the desired outcomes. It's not that you avoid getting bad information, but you provide the best solution that you can. And then these teams of people who are doing the work are capturing the data in real time. But from that information, technology allows us to automate tasks, structure data, and then manage the way we create output. So it could be triggers to let people know, hey, this system's leaking too much and we're going to get off track on our carbon emission goals in this area. It can have teams change the way they look at the future. So maybe the primary goal has always been keep the butter cold, keep the ice cream from melting. Maybe part of the next level of goals are keep the emission rate down relative to that. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that. So there is some calculus. And for those of you who are already working with Trakref, all the mechanics are already in place for you. You don't have to wonder, are we ready? The mass balance calculations should account for your purchases and acquisitions, sales, disbursements, changes to installed capacity. Not every purchase, remember, is about filling a leak. And a lot of these regulatory frameworks that are emerging do talk about that. So the only way to ensure that there's operational success to these outcomes that can be audited is for you to rely on your operations process or team to be able to capture this information accurately. Now, there are two formats. We're going to go over the climate action reserves format, which is the same as the IPCCs and the TCFDs, and I'll share that with you. It talks about FG01 and FG02, and they're really based around whether you have access or what level of information you have access to. Now, what this should look like to you is very simple, a ledger that you would record transactions in that would ultimately lead to a balance sheet, and from there, even further, a P&L. Because we're basically talking about a new kind of accounting process for something that is frequently now being referred to as not economics, but carbonomics. And greater attention to this carbon management and the decision-making process is going to require that you have immediate access to this information, which is going to far exceed your ability to use spreadsheets or a CMMS system to be able to capture all this data. Because the CMMS systems, you still have to extract that information. Business entities, no matter whether you're a large advanced filer or a small filer, small as 70 million plus, you're going to have issues around buying carbon offsets. You may not have thought about that, but I promise you it's coming. Investments in low CO2 emission technologies are also important, and being able to talk about that on your balance sheet is key. The only way to do that is to make sure that you're capturing that information the right way. So if you're a service provider and you're thinking, well, I just want to let Trakref know that we added this asset to the system. Well, that might not be good enough in the future for our shared clients, because their anticipation is that they have a material transaction that manages the extraction and then manages the install, and they can record that transaction in a way that will show up on this ledger. We're seeing that in California. Anybody who's ever called the team knows that the very first thing we ask is this shutdown or install part of a California location? If the answer is yes, we get a lot more details. You can expect that very same response at a national and an international level in a very short period of time, within 8 months. So lots of things are changing. Another thing to note is governments and business entities, shareholders, companies, they want to be able to monitor what these changes in behavior look like and how they affect the bottom line. So they're going to be comparing ESG and financial records constantly for the rest of the time that we work together. So to finish out the formula on the equation, and I'm happy to share this with anybody. We share the document afterwards, but if you need the full climate action reserve document, we're happy to share it as well. But again, what this does is it just further extends the logic for the calculus that's expected in order for whoever's filing those 10Ks to get that assurance or attestation from an outside vendor. They're going to ask. Now, if you're in Trakref, we're already doing this. We already have a report. This is what the report looks like. This is, let's see, this is the P&L version. And you want to use familiar tools that CFOs and people who are used to signing these 10Ks and people who are used to doing audits and attestation have reference to. You want to be able to drill in. You want to know what's your starting number and what's your ending number. And the weight of those systems could have 1,000 pounds at the beginning of the quarter and 1,000 pounds at the end of a quarter in the same building, but you may have switched from 404 to 448 and cut your GWP impact for that site in half. You look like a rock star. The guys who are in the corner office and want to take a look at these numbers, they're going to want to see, wow, we invested $80,000 in this retrofit, and bam, look what just came out at the other end. Our GWP numbers went down. They may even find budget for you on certain leaky assets that you never would have thought you'd be able to get money from. So, or money to change. But the familiarity with this is important. And another thing I like to talk about here is, you'll notice this is the balance sheet version of that same report. We feel like for decades, nearly 100 years, the financial industry has owned the bottom line. We've all heard people say to us, well, what's the bottom line on this one? Well, we think environmental reporting and scope 1 emissions is the top line. So we'll leave the bottom line to the finance guys. But here in the sustainability and scope 1 emissions reporting world, we're top line people. And we want to be able to present these documents, and you want to be able to have access to these documents in a way that you can read them and they can be audited. So for instance, here you might find you have a store or a location and you want to track all of the 410 emissions versus the 449 emissions, or how 449 can actually have a greater negative impact by lowering your GWP than the leaks that you might experience in 404. It's a great story to tell, and this is the exact story that's expected of you as you have to do this reporting. And that's why we feel like technology is really the only way to do it. Any questions so far, Gavin? Okay.
Nope.
3 more minutes. 3 minutes and I'll hit my 30-minute mark, but I think I can get there. Look, software enables governance. In Trakref specifically, as it should be in any software system, you should be able to control who sees what, when, where, and then what edits they have, what editable control they have over that data. In Trakref, service providers have access to capture data and input data, but not much access to edit data. And that creates a governance opportunity and an interactive moment for us to work together with these service providers so that we create an assurance path for that information. Also, you want to streamline the amount of data that you capture. You don't want lots of disparate information. You want to create a lot of structure around it. There probably hasn't been a day since March 21st that I haven't been on some type of ESG discussion. And the very first thing all these platforms talk about is flexibility. Flexibility is your enemy when you go to get an attestable result. You need firmness and structure. Now that exists in Trakref. It exists for a reason. And it doesn't exist at the spur of a moment. This took decades to evolve. And so we have a hyper-specific taxonomy to accommodate all this. Reporting, record keeping, the ability to isolate data, material types, even classes of equipment. The next thing you want to pay attention to is the ability to update, deploy policy changes quickly to the workforce. That's happening. As you can imagine, every single thing on this checklist is happening inside Trakref. But one of the stories that I always go back to is this story that JP Morgan experienced almost 10 years ago now. Actually, it was 10 years ago, where there was a copy and paste mistake on an Excel spreadsheet, and it led to a $6 billion trading loss for them. Excel spreadsheets they don't provide any governance. They can provide a great place to host data or information, but it's the governance here that's going to matter the most. And if you're part of operations and you're trying to exhibit to management that you have the tools in place and the resources and the awareness, they're all right here. So for anybody already working in Trakref, you have those resources. Now, I mentioned it a minute ago, structured data, flexible frequency on reporting, that's important. Inside Trakref, if you're using it today, we have the IPCC carbon factors built in from AR4. AR4 is the last year IPCC published 100-year numbers for the carbon impact from refrigerants. IPCC 5 and 6 were the 20-year numbers. All right, so just keep that in mind. We use the IPCC 4, which is the 100-year numbers, which is the common numbers. And that's also what's expected if you're following any of the TCFD, IPCC, or Climate Action Reserve frameworks. GRI, SASB, I'm going to get to those in a second too. You want to make sure that you get access to formatted, aligned reporting to global standards. And the last and most important thing is manage the end-to-end transactions. We have a really interesting client that has ownership by a German bank. And this bank has a very different way of looking at things than their US counterparts. They're a US-based company, but because their bank is based in Europe, they're forcing them to manage regulatory reporting responsibilities for the EU as well. The key I tell everybody is document normal service, and all the rest of that stuff takes care of itself. This is an update on what's actually happening over the next few months. Pay close attention. As I mentioned before, happy to share any of this. Every one of these events will have an impact and a bearing on all of us on this call. So whether it's the ISSB, the SEC, or the FRAG, and yes, it sounds like alphabet soup, it is. Each one of these has a very specific thing that they're better at than the other. And so we see this merging together of all these issues. And the SEC probably will be very satisfied with scope 1 and 2 emission reporting, but they will follow things like the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures and affect all public reporting companies. This document's 534 pages long. It's a monster, but it's very insightful when you read through it. And happy to share that with anyone. June 9th, as I mentioned. ISSB is July 29th, and FRAG is August 8th. You have plenty of time to make comments on that. As I mentioned before, there were 5,000 comments alone on the SEC's website for ESG disclosures. And if you're thinking, well, what does 5,000 mean? It's 70 times more comments for ESG disclosures. Then in 2010, on the heels of the collapse of the financial industry in the United States, when the SEC updated the 10K filing responsibilities and the 1934 Securities Exchange Commission Act. I mean, this was like the big overhaul. There are 70 times more people who responded to the ESG reporting upgrade than to the entire SEC upgrade in 2010. Frankly, that fascinates me. I think that tells a story about how many people are really engaged in this topic. I always like to share a tip, that we experience here, and it's on behalf of all of our clients who we've worked with. These are 5 things that we find are extraordinarily common, because we know there's going to be some gaps in the data, and we know the data is not going to be perfect, but if you know what to look for, we found that's a really big help in looking around corners to find problems. Changes in assets will change installed capacity. Oftentimes, removing and adding refrigerants, it can be an install to a system, which is not a leak, which changes your installed capacity, but not your leak or loss related to carbon. It can be refrigerant used for installs or leaks, impact the balance sheet differently. If it's an asset or an activity, depends on how it's applied. I can't tell you how many times we work with clients who have asset registries that do not include the following 2 items: material, like what type of refrigerant are you using, and 2, what's the quantity. Sometimes we get one or not the other. Amazes me, the number on that one is over 85% of new clients to Trakref. Those are the 2 missing pieces of information. And lastly, service that's recorded on an asset that doesn't exist. If you're thinking that doesn't happen, you would be wrong. It happens every single day, whether it's a leak inspection or a refrigerant transaction on an asset that's no longer there. Anybody who's ever walked up on a roof and looked at 20 package units knows that at times you make a mistake, you pick the wrong one, and you get the wrong refrigerant type listed, and that can have a big impact on your balance sheet. Last couple of slides, but this one's really the last one, material. 25%, that's the leak rate in the US, 600 million pounds. You want to do 3 things. You want to set up a registry internally to your company, establish key roles and metrics. Your software should be able to help you do that, create governance around that topic by setting operational definitions and policies. And lastly, most important, accountability. Your governance doesn't matter if you never use it. If you're a service provider and you're trying to get action on a leaky asset and it's not happening, have an escalation policy and be able to document that. If you're an owner and your service person did some service work, but it was 3 weeks ago and they forgot to notify you about it and they got to go back and they got a leak, it's got another leak, talk to them, write them up, have a discussion about it. Because if you don't use that governance control, then you actually never had governance. You just had a bunch of policies. Lastly, consumption, misreporting. This is huge. I don't know anybody that's actually accurately reporting their emission numbers. I look through hundreds of ESG reports annually, and I can tell you, nobody is. A large airline the other day reported less than 30 pounds of refrigerant lost from their air operations. 30 pounds. This is a large airline, not one, not 100, not 1,000 airplanes, but more than that. This is a very big company. No one's going to believe those numbers. All right, guys, we are a bunch of geeks here, but every bit of what we do is plowed into the software. If we learn something, it goes into the software. We host a meeting, we talk about it, but we put it in the software. We put everything there that we learn from every experience, and we go through those every day. All right, we've got 2 more upcoming events. Both of them are about ESG, sustainability, climate. I find this topic not only fascinating, but I find it top of mind for every single person I'm working with. We're going to talk about how ESG reporting falls short. And we have this amazing team of University of Virginia Darden graduate school students work with us through the entire last year. And we're going to do this project again next year. We did a survey with them. Absolutely amazing stuff. We look forward to sharing that with you as well. Moment of shameless commerce. Yes, that's Trakref in the shopping cart. guys, it's time to get started. If you're here and you're learning, we're happy to share. But the most important sharing we do is when we're engaged in a solution. So, Gavin, how'd I do? I came in a little bit late, but I covered everything. Any questions?
Oh, it looks like we're all set. Unless there's
Everybody
any
stayed awake?
questions.
Chase, anything you want to add?
No, this isn't temporary. This isn't associated with politics in office. Once the SEC puts something in place, it's here to stay. I think, as you mentioned in the beginning, scope 3 is really the only slippery slope, because what that would imply is any private vendor that provides a widget or a service to a publicly traded company would therefore have to capture their scope 1 and 2. I believe the SEC thinks that's a little bit of an overreach and unrealistic at this time. But scope 1 and scope 2 are things that these organizations have direct control over. So they're going to be here over the next 3 to 5 years, based on your company size. I think scope 3, we're going to see a step back, but it's exciting. It makes a fair playing field. And I think what's interesting is the large organizations such as the Shells and the Marathon Petroleums are the ones pushing this, because they want to be evaluated the same way as everybody else. And have a fair field that they're operating on. So it's good long term, but when you got that kind of money and power behind the push, everyone knows how America works. It's here to stay. So,
yeah, and anybody who's on this call who's used a spreadsheet before, Trakref's just the software. We get our interactions are with these emerging groups that are out there in the consulting world that are behaving very similarly to companies like Accenture, but at a more focused ESG level. And we're finding fascinating results there. Hyper acceleration of engagement, a change in the way a company's posture is related to the ESG reports. We're noticing really rapid awareness at a lot of different levels, and happy to share those experiences with anybody who wants to hear about them. But I think for the purpose of today, we covered everything. Right, Gavin?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Everybody, thanks for 45 minutes of your day. I hope we made good use of it. I appreciate it. And we'll share. We've got a really nice download that goes with this today, related to sustainability and climate action reserve accounting, and a little bit of a dive, at least a moment of expression on double materiality and what that means. Means more if you're a European-based company or a company with an operation in Europe, but it will mean something here eventually, because that will transcend financial disclosure or ESG disclosure responsibilities here as well. All right, guys, have a great day.
thanks.